I want to be precise about what I observed, because I was there for all of it, and because the review committee deserves a record that does not editorialize. I have read the summary my junior specialist filed. It is accurate in its data points and wrong in its interpretation. They concluded that the anomalies were equipment drift. I no longer believe that. I stopped believing it somewhere around hour 60, and I want to explain, in the order that things happened, why. My name is Sothvaran. I hold a senior assessor's certification in xenobiological environmental tolerance from the Verith Institute, and I have conducted stress protocol evaluations on 47 distinct sapient species across 18 field postings. I say this not to establish authority but to establish baseline, to make clear that what follows is not the record of a novice who misread standard data, but of a trained specialist who watched his model fail in real time, and is now attempting to document that failure as precisely as the data allows. I know what physiological breakdown looks like. I know the sequence: thermoregulatory strain first, then cortisol analog cascade, then sleep architecture collapse, then cognitive narrowing, then the body's systems begin to argue with each other about resource allocation, and the argument turns ugly. I have watched that sequence in 47 species. I can predict its onset within 4 to 6 of their biological hours, depending on prior conditioning and individual resilience. The sequence is not a theory. It is a mechanism. It is what happens when you impose conditions that require a body to spend resources managing its own stability faster than it can replenish them. The gap between expenditure and replenishment is where Cascade lives. It is the most reliable thing I know. The human did not follow the sequence. He did not follow the sequence across 4 days of controlled environmental stress at parameters I selected specifically because they sat at the upper boundary of our documented human tolerance range. Not beyond it. I want to be clear about that. I was not conducting a termination study. I was conducting a threshold study. The distinction matters enormously, because what I observed was not a subject refusing to die at the edge of lethal parameters. What I observed was a subject who did not appear to register that he was under stress at all. Let me begin at the beginning. We arrived at the human structure on the 43rd day of the Varath Expeditionary Survey's regional assessment phase. The structure was a low, fortified compound set into a hillside in a sparsely populated region of the planet's northern temperate zone, and it had been vacated by its primary occupant some days before our forward element established the perimeter. Our logistics officer, Subcommander Thresi Okal, assessed it as an ideal staging facility, reinforced construction, deep underground sections for equipment storage and personnel quarters, independent power and water systems that ran on local generation rather than external grid dependency. She directed the survey team to occupy it and establish field operations there. I noted at the time that the structure was unusually well provisioned. The underground sections contained stores of preserved food sufficient for extended isolation, filtration systems for both water and atmospheric processing, medical supplies well beyond what any reasonable personal emergency cache would require, and a quantity of tools and raw materials whose purpose I found difficult to immediately categorize. There was organized storage for components I did not recognize, arranged with the systematic care of someone who had thought carefully about what they might need and in what order they might need it. My junior specialist Arn Moval cataloged the contents and estimated the stores sufficient to sustain one adult human for approximately 3 of the planet's years without resupply. I recorded this in the intake log as an indicator of unusual forethought in the structure's owner, filed it under Local Cultural Assessment, Further Review Recommended, and moved on to establishing the survey team's operational footprint. I did not yet understand what it meant. I think about that now. The human was located at the level. He had not, as we initially assumed, fled the region. He had been 2 levels below our primary operations floor in a section of the structure our initial survey had assessed as non-functional, a set of rooms behind a sealed internal door that we had not opened because the door's construction made it appear to be a fixed, structural element rather than a usable entry point. It was very well made. The seam was barely visible under our scan equipment. Sub-Commander Okal's security team discovered him When a routine maintenance inspection of our atmospheric processors turned up a secondary intake duct that we had inadvertently sealed during our installation of field equipment. The duct ran horizontally through the structure's lower wall before bending down to the rooms he was occupying. We had, without realizing it, been slowly restricting airflow to his space for 11 days. He was sitting at a work table when they opened the lower section. He was reading something. A physical document, not an electronic one, and annotated in his species script, the look of something he had read before and was reading again. He looked up when the security team entered and said something in his language, which our translator rendered, with moderate confidence, as an expression of mild greeting and a question about how long that was going to take, because he had noticed the air quality dropping 3 days ago, and it was starting to get a little thin. 3 days. He had been breathing progressively oxygen-depleted air for 3 days and had characterized it as a little thin. Subcommander Oakhall had him brought up to the primary level and asked me to conduct a baseline assessment. This is standard procedure for any sapient subject encountered in a field survey zone. I have conducted dozens. Process takes approximately 1 standard session: physical examination, metabolic scan, cognitive baseline, stress indicator panel, referenced against the species data file. The data file for humans at that time was thin but not empty. We had records from prior survey contacts. Average morphology, standard atmospheric requirements, documented tolerance ranges for temperature, pressure, atmospheric composition, sustained exertion. Known fragility points. The human species was categorized in our database as moderately resilient, Class 3 generalist sapient, flea equivalent to several other warm-blooded sapients of comparable body mass and metabolic profile. The man I assessed was 41 of his years old. He was of average height for his sex and of moderate build, not heavily muscled, not lean to the point of physiological compromise. He had a beard that had grown approximately 10 days beyond deliberate grooming, told me he had been in the lower section for at least that long before we found him. His skin showed the pallor you would expect from extended time without sunlight exposure. His eyes were clear and tracked with alert precision. His respiration was measured and even, 8 cycles per minute at rest, in the lower range of documented human norms. He was cooperative. He answered questions through the translator without hesitation or apparent anxiety. He gave his name and approximate age without being asked, which suggested either familiarity with formal intake processes or a reading of the situation that told him cooperation was the appropriate posture. I was not certain which at the time. When I asked him how he was feeling, he said fine, a little stiff from the cot, and asked if we had any coffee. We did not know what coffee was at the time. He described it. A brewed extract from a plant-derived seed, mildly stimulating, consumed warm, and seemed entirely unsurprised when we could not provide it. He asked instead for something warm in a general sense, and accepted what we gave him without complaint. I noted his cortisol analog markers while he drank. They were low, not suppressed low, would have indicated sedation or psychological dissociation, just low, as in a resting subject in an untroubled environment, the kind of reading you get from someone who has been sitting quietly and has nothing pressing on their mind. I re-ran the scan twice. The results were consistent. I noted this as slightly anomalous in the context of his recent history. 12 days in an increasingly oxygen-depleted space alone, with no contact with other members of his species, no access to communication, no knowledge of what had happened above him, and attributed it to individual variation and possible prior conditioning. Some subjects acclimate quickly after a stressor is removed. The removal of the stressor produces a rebound effect, and what you see in the immediate aftermath is a body in fast recovery, which can look superficially similar to a body that was never under stress at all. I noted this interpretation in my intake record and submitted a recommendation to Subcommander Oakhall that the subject be retained for the SA team's standard environmental tolerance assessment, rather than transferred to the regional processing facility. She approved the recommendation. The survey mandate includes documentation of sapient stress response profiles where practical. This was practical. That is how the assessment began. The environmental tolerance protocol I designed for the human was what I would describe as conservative. I selected parameters from the upper range of documented human tolerance, conditions that would, according to our data file, produce measurable physiological stress without causing systemic harm. My intent was to identify the gradient. At what point does the human body begin to show the predictable stress cascade? Where is the threshold? Where does the comfortable maintenance region end and the survival cost region begin? The data file gave me a starting range. I intended to find the exact edge. The parameters I selected were as follows. Ambient temperature at the lower boundary of documented human thermal discomfort. Cold enough to require meaningful active thermoregulatory effort without triggering hypothermic cascade, the kind of cold that makes a body work to stay warm rather than simply failing to. Atmospheric oxygen at a level approximately 8% below his measured ambient preference, mimicking mild hypoxic load, enough to create ongoing demand on his respiratory system without approaching the threshold of acute impairment. Sleep cycle disruption via irregular illumination cycling, shifting his available rest windows in a pseudo-random sequence designed to prevent his circadian architecture from finding a stable anchor, while leaving adequate total rest opportunity to preclude simple sleep deprivation. Caloric intake reduced to approximately 60% of his estimated baseline metabolic requirement, enough to create a sustained energy deficit that would require his body to begin prioritizing resource allocation, a process that shows up clearly in behavioral and biochemical markers within first 48 hours. None of these parameters individually were dangerous. In combination, they were designed to place his body under the kind of sustainable system load that would, in my experience, reliably surface the stress cascade within the first 24 to 36 hours. I had run versions of this protocol on 6 other sapient species. The average time to first cascade indicator was 19 hours and 40 minutes. The fastest was 11 hours, in a species with a notably efficient but narrow-range homeostatic mechanism. The slowest was 31 hours, in a particularly large-bodied cold-adapted species that I had expected to outlast the others. Even that one had shown clear stress hormone elevation by the second morning. Set up the monitoring suite in the assessment chamber, a room in the converted structure's middle level that had adequate dimensions for the purpose, with instrument panels along one wall and a viewing aperture I had screened to be non-obvious from the subject's side. And I explained to the subject, through the translator, what the protocol involved. I told him it was a standard environmental assessment. I did not tell him the specific parameters. Standard procedure. You want behavioral response to environmental conditions, not to foreknowledge of environmental conditions. Foreknowledge changes behavior and contaminates the stress indicator data. He asked if he could keep his book. I said yes. He asked if the temperature was going to drop. I said there would be some variation in environmental conditions over the course of the assessment. He said he figured as much, because he could already feel the air handling had changed, and the temperature in the room was reading about 2 degrees below ambient when he walked in. He asked if we could calibrate it to at least cold, rather than damp cold, because damp cold got into his joints. He tapped his knee when he said this, in a gesture I took to indicate a prior injury or chronic sensitivity. I told him I would note the preference. He nodded and settled himself at the work table and opened his book. I returned to the monitoring suite and began the protocol. First 12 hours proceeded entirely within expected parameters. His thermoregulatory response to the reduced ambient temperature was textbook. Peripheral vasoconstriction moving inward from the extremities, a slight elevation in core metabolic output as his body compensated for surface heat loss, an increase in minor movement behaviors consistent with passive heat generation, the small shifts of position, the occasional tightening of the torso, the way the hands pulled slightly toward the body's core, entirely normal. His oxygen saturation declined modestly in the first 2 hours as the atmospheric mix shifted, then stabilized as his respiration rate made an automatic minor adjustment, deepening the breath cycle fractionally to extract more per cycle. All of this was normal. All of it was what the data file predicted. I went to my quarters at the 14-hour mark, expecting that when I reviewed the monitoring data in the morning, I would see the beginning of the cortisol elevation. The first sign, the stress architecture starting to move. Cortisol analog was flat, not suppressed, not absent. Flat in the sense that it had not meaningfully moved from his baseline reading. In my experience, by hour 14 of sustained multiparameter load, the stress hormone profile begins to climb, not dramatically, a 15% elevation above baseline. Enough to see on a standard graph. Enough to know the body has registered that conditions are not favorable and has begun mobilizing its management resources. The human stress hormone profile looked like the readout of a subject sitting in a comfortable chair in a temperature-controlled room with nothing. I checked the equipment. I ran a calibration test on the monitoring suite. All instruments were functioning correctly. I cross-referenced his sleep data from the night. He had slept approximately 6 hours in 2 segments, a longer block of about 4 hours and a shorter continuation of 2, which was within normal range for his species, even accounting for the disrupted illumination cycling. I had expected more fragmentation. His sleep architecture, the internal structure of rest phases as recorded by the neurological monitoring surface I had placed in his pillow with his knowledge, was slightly compressed relative to the baseline we had measured on intake day, but intact. The deeper rest phases were present and reasonably well formed. I had expected those to be the first thing the illumination disruption eroded. I noted all of this and extended the protocol. Standard procedure when the initial cascade window passes without expected indicators. Extend and observe. Day 2. His temperature regulation had settled into what I can only describe as an efficient holding pattern. The cold was doing what cold does, extracting heat from the body's surface at a steady rate that the ambient conditions imposed, and his body was placing that heat with a quiet, steady metabolic output that showed no signs of strain. I want to be precise about this, because the word strain has a specific meaning in my field. A body under thermoregulatory strain is burning resources faster than it would prefer. The graphs show it as an elevated metabolic rate that tracks consistently with the external cold load. With no adaptation plateau, the body keeps paying, keeps burning, keeps working, and the cost does not diminish, because the body has not found a way to reduce the draw. What I was watching in his metabolic data was different. There was elevation relative to his baseline, yes, but the elevation was not tracking with the cold load. It had found a level and stayed there, a stable, efficient operating point rather than a grinding upward pressure. His body had, in some internal way I could not fully account for, found the most economical response to the cold and locked onto it. He was eating the reduced calorie provisions without complaint. He finished each meal, set the container aside, and went back to whatever he was doing. He was not, as far as I could observe, particularly hungry. I have seen what hunger looks like in a subject on restricted caloric intake at the 48-hour mark. There is a behavioral signature, increased attention to food-related stimuli, a subtle restlessness that clusters around mealtime anticipation, mild irritability when the meal is smaller than the appetite, diminished capacity for sustained focus on non-servable tasks as the brain's resource. Allocation system begins to reprioritize. He was reading his book with the same apparent absorption he'd shown on day 1. When I watched through the observation aperture, his focus on the page looked complete. At the 60-hour mark, junior specialist, Aaron Moval, came to me with the sleep disruption data and asked if I thought we should recalibrate the illumination cycling because the subject was adapting to it faster than the protocol assumed was possible. Adapting to it. That was the word she used. I remember it precisely because it was the first time one of my team used a word that implied the subject was doing something active in response to protocol rather than simply failing to respond to it in the expected way. I looked at the data. She was right. The irregular illumination cycling that I had designed to prevent his sleep system from establishing a predictable anchor, a sequence I had, constructed from a pseudo-random generator specifically to resist pattern recognition, was being navigated with increasing accuracy over time, not consciously, not deliberately. As far as I could determine, the data showed that his body was locating rest windows in the irregular cycle with improving precision across successive days, as though some mechanism below conscious awareness was sampling the disruption pattern. extracting a signal from what I had designed to be noise, and using that signal to route his sleep architecture around the interference. By the third day, his effective sleep consolidation had actually improved from its disrupted day one baseline. I told her to leave the cycling as it was. I wanted to see how far the adaptation went. I want to pause here and explain something about what made this particularly disorienting to observe. Environmental stress protocols work on a simple principle. You impose conditions that require the body to spend resources managing its own stability, and you do this faster than the body can replenish those resources. The gap between expenditure and replenishment is where the cascade lives. Every body has a maintenance budget, a quantity of physiological resources it can devote to keeping its systems in stable alignment, and every sustained stressor is a draw on that budget. Introduce enough draws simultaneously, at sufficient intensity, and the budget goes into deficit. When the budget goes into deficit, the body begins to triage which systems are essential right now, which can be temporarily under-resourced. Triage process is the cascade. It is measurable, predictable, and, once started, self-reinforcing, because the degradation of one system creates additional load on the others, and the load compounds. I have watched this in 47 species. I understand its mechanism intimately. What I was watching in the human's data was a body that appeared to have a maintenance budget I could not exhaust with the parameters I had set. And what was disturbing was not the fact of that budget. It was the quality of it, the absence of strain, the efficiency. His body was not fighting the protocol. It was absorbing it. On day 3, I increased 2 of the parameters. I lowered the ambient temperature an additional 4 degrees, bringing it to a level that our data file classified as a cold stress threshold. The point at which, according to documented human physiology, sustained exposure begins to produce measurable thermoregulatory strain, and the energy cost of maintaining core temperature starts to rise nonlinearly. I also reduced the caloric provision to 45% of baseline metabolic requirement, which is below the level our data file identifies as the onset point for metabolic conservation responses. Put on an additional layer of clothing he had in the chamber. A thick outer garment, well used, kind of thing a person keeps ready rather than packed away, and ate his reduced meal without comment. He held the warm container from the meal in both hands for longer than usual after he finished eating, which was the clearest behavioral marker of cold awareness I had observed from him up to that point. He held it until it was cool, and then set it aside. He did not ask for more food. He did not ask for warmer conditions. He sat quietly for a few minutes after the meal, and then went back to his book. I watched this through the observation aperture and noted it carefully. A body that is genuinely calorie restricted will show that restriction in subtle ways before the subject is consciously aware of it. A slight slowing of deliberate movement, a narrowing of voluntary activity range, the body economizing without instruction, a tendency to remain still when still is possible. I was watching for these signs. What I observed was a person who was slightly cold, had just eaten a smaller meal than he would have preferred, and had returned to reading with no particular indication that either condition was weighing on him heavily. His cortisol analog remained flat. I sat in the monitoring suite for a long time that evening, looking at the readouts. Arne Movil had gone to her quarters. My other junior specialist, a young researcher named Delvin Sorath, who had joined the survey 3 postings ago and who I had never seen shaken by field data in all the time I had worked with him, came to stand beside me and looked at the readouts for a while without speaking. After several minutes, he said, "The equipment is functioning correctly." I said yes. I had run calibrations that morning, and again after the parameter increase. He said, "I have run the comparative analysis against the species data file, accounting for body mass, metabolic class, and documented tolerance range. A comparable subject from 9 of the 12 nearest equivalent species in our database would be showing significant cascade indicators by now. Stress hormone elevation above 30%, measurable sleep architecture degradation, cognitive screening scores down." I said I was aware. He said, "What about the other 3? I told him. The other 3 were all either primary hypoxic adapted or cold adapted as part of their native evolutionary history. Biological specialists, evolved for environments that required specific narrow-range tolerances at high performance levels. The human was not classified as a specialist. It was classified as a generalist, a species that could live in a broad range of environments at the cost of excelling in none of them specifically. Delvin Sorath looked at the readouts for another moment. Then he said, very quietly, "What is the difference between a generalist with a very broad tolerance range and a specialist?" I told him to go to sleep. The question stayed with me through the night, and I was still turning it over when I reviewed the morning data on day 4. He asked, through the chamber intercom, if we could fix the heating unit on the east wall. He said the thermal output on that side was uneven, colder in one corner than the other, and it was making the cot uncomfortable at night because cold was coming up through the floor on that side, and he kept waking up and moving to a warmer position. He said this the way a person reports a minor facility issue to building management. Matter of fact, without urgency, in the expectation that it would be handled in a reasonable time. I want to note what he was not complaining about. He was not complaining about the temperature itself. He was complaining about the uneven distribution of the temperature. He was, functionally, telling me that my cold stress protocol, 4 days of deliberately reduced ambient temperature, now pushed to a documented threshold level, had produced a minor ergonomic inconvenience involving sleeping comfort. I sent a maintenance request to Subcommander Okal's facilities team about the heating unit. That is where the title of this report comes from, if the committee is wondering. I increased the oxygen deprivation parameter on the morning of day 4 to 11% below his measured preference, a level that our data file, classified as moderate hypoxic load, capable of producing measurable cognitive performance degradation in human subjects after sustained exposure, with known effects on working memory, processing speed, and attentional control. He noticed within 2 hours. He set his book down, looked at the air handling panel on the wall, and said through the intercom that the air had gotten thinner again, and was that intentional because he was starting to get a headache. A headache. Not the behavioral markers of developing oxygen deficit, the slow blinking, the loss of task focus, the shortened sentence construction, the reduced verbal fluency that is the first cognitive sign. A headache, which he reported with the same flat informational tone one might use to mention that a door hinge needed oil. I reduced the parameter by 3 points and told him it was a calibration issue. He said thank you, added that it usually cleared up for him in about half an hour, once the air was back to normal, and picked up his book again. His cortisol analog, through the headache episode, had risen 2% above baseline. It returned to baseline 22 minutes later. I sat back in my monitoring chair and looked at the cortisol readout for a long time. Here is what I want the committee to understand. I am not an excitable person. I have spent a professional career in the business of measuring biological responses to controlled stress. I have long since lost the capacity to be startled by unusual data. Unusual data is what I am paid to find. What I experienced in that monitoring suite on the 4th day of the human assessment was not excitement. It was a specific sensation I have only encountered a handful of times in my career, and it is the sensation of a model failing. Not being challenged, failing. A model in the scientific sense is not just a theory. It is the accumulated weight of everything you know about how a system behaves, the patterns, the tolerances, the expected sequences, the predictive framework built over years of observation and data, and the confirmed predictions that gave you confidence in the framework. When you encounter data that your model cannot accommodate, there is a moment before you begin the work of revising the model where you simply feel it fail. You feel the weight of what you knew shifting under you, becoming uncertain, rearranging itself into something less stable than it was. The human was not supposed to be able to do what the data was showing me he was doing. That is not an emotional statement. That is a precise technical statement. The Verith Institute's environmental tolerance protocols are built on a body of comparative xenobiological data spanning more than 2 centuries of field assessments across more than 40 species. The parameters I had selected were selected specifically because they fell within the upper range of documented human tolerance, not beyond it. But our documented human tolerance range was, I was coming to understand, based on a very limited body of contact data. Short duration assessments. Subjects who were already under stress from prior circumstances of contact. Averages drawn from a small sample, extrapolated outward by researchers, who had every reason to assume that a Class 3 generalist sapient would behave like the other Class 3 generalist sapients they had catalogued, and who had no particular reason to push the upper boundary of the human range, because the lower and middle range data seemed consistent and sufficient. What if they were wrong about the upper boundary? What if our data file had been built on a sample that happened to be at the low end of the human distribution? Stressed subjects, subjects in poor prior condition, subjects who were not representative of what a baseline healthy, provisioned adult human looked like under controlled conditions. What if the upper boundary of the human tolerance range, the number I had been treating as the ceiling, was not the ceiling but somewhere in the middle? I sat with that question for a long time before I did anything with it. There is a particular discipline required when a model fails. A discipline against the instinct to rationalize the failure away, find the more comfortable interpretation and lean on it. I have seen researchers do it. I have done it myself, in earlier field postings, when anomalous data arrived that was easier to attribute to equipment error or subject atypicality than to a genuine gap in the model. The discipline requires you to sit with the discomfort of not knowing and refuse to resolve it prematurely, to hold the anomaly in view until you have done the work of understanding it properly, even when that work will require you to revise something you had considered settled. I ran the comparative analysis myself that night, with Delvin Sorath's questions still turning in my head. I pulled every Class 3 generalist sapient in the database. Species not evolved for specific, extreme environments, species classified as broadly adaptable without extreme specialist capabilities. And I ran the accumulated stress load I had imposed on the human subject across 4 days against each species' documented tolerance parameters, using a standardized load equivalence calculation that accounts for body mass, metabolic rate, and documented homeostatic range. 23 of the 27 species I pulled, the accumulated 4-day load I had applied, would have produced significant cascade indicators by this point. For 11 of those 23, the load would have produced cascade onset by day 2. For 3 of the 11 parameters I had been using for the first 2 days would have been sufficient on their own to trigger a measurable cascade without the day 3 and day 4 increases. For the 4 remaining species, including humans, the load fell within the upper region of the documented tolerance range but below the threshold of predicted cascade onset. But here is the part I kept returning to. 3 of those 4 remaining species, I had chosen parameters that were genuinely close to the documented ceiling. Close enough that their physiological graphs, even without showing full cascade, showed clear upward movement in stress indicators, clear evidence that the load was being felt. Systems working hard, maintaining stability, but spending resources to do it. The graphs for those 3 species looked like graphs of something being pushed. The humans' graphs looked like graphs of something at rest. I had not come close to his ceiling. I had not come close to it because his ceiling was somewhere up above where I had been, somewhere my parameters had not reached, somewhere the data file had not told me to look, because the data file had been built from contacts too short and conditions too uncontrolled to ever map that territory. On day 5, the last full day of the protocol, I did something I want to document transparently, because I am aware it was outside standard procedure, and I do not want there to be ambiguity about it. I increased all 4 parameters simultaneously to the maximum values I could justify under the assessment mandate. Proved the lowest temperature I could apply without crossing into documented hypothermic risk range. The lowest oxygen saturation I could apply without crossing into documented acute cognitive impairment range. The most aggressive sleep disruption cycling I could implement while leaving statistically adequate rest windows, and the lowest caloric provision I could maintain, while remaining above the documented metabolic minimum for his body mass. I want to be direct about why I did this. I needed to know where the ceiling was. After 4 days of watching him not respond in the expected way, I needed data from a higher load level, and I had a final day of the protocol to get it. I judged that I was still operating within the bounds of the assessment mandate because I was not exceeding any single documented risk threshold. I am aware that the committee may view this differently. I record my reasoning accurately. He was quiet for most of that day. Not withdrawn. When I asked questions through the intercom, he answered without hesitation, and his responses were coherent and contextually appropriate, showing no signs of the cognitive compression I was watching for. He was just quiet in the way a person is quiet when they have found a functional internal equilibrium and see no reason to disturb it. Settled. Not still in the sense of suppressed or withdrawn, but still in the sense of having arrived somewhere he could maintain without much effort. In the late afternoon, he paced the chamber for approximately an hour. A deliberate, measured pace, not the restless cycling of a stressed subject looking for relief, but the pacing of a person engaging in intentional physical activity for its own sake, keeping their body from stiffening. When I asked through the intercom why he was pacing, he said he needed to move. He asked if there was anything he could do that would be useful. Because he was starting to get bored, and he did better when he had something to work on. Bored. At the 96-hour mark, cortisol analog was 6% above his baseline reading. 6%. I have assessed subjects of 17 other species at equivalent or lower sustained load levels, and observed cortisol analog elevations of between 40 and 300% above baseline by the equivalent hour mark. The lowest I had ever recorded from a non-specialist species under comparable load conditions before this assessment was 38%, in an individual who had scored in the exceptional range on every prior resilience metric I had tested. The human, four days and 4 nights of what I had designed as a meaningful environmental stress protocol, producing a stress hormones response that I would classify, in any other species I had ever assessed, as below the threshold of clinical significance. He asked, through the intercom, if we could do something about the boredom. He said he had finished his book and would appreciate something else to read, or something to do with his hands. He said he was a reasonably good carpenter, if there was any work that needed doing in the structure, because he had noticed, when they first brought him up, that some of the interior partition framing showed what looked like moisture damage, and if we had the materials, he would be happy to look at it. He seemed genuinely interested in the prospect, not as a plea for relief from the conditions, but as a person who preferred to be useful and had been sitting without purpose for longer than suited his temperament. I ended the protocol that evening, not because I had found the ceiling, because I understood that I was not going to find the ceiling with the instruments and parameters available to me, and because continuing to escalate was beginning to cross a line I was not comfortable with professionally, given what I had observed about how little the load seemed to be affecting him. I sat with Aaron Movil and Delvin Sorath that night, and we went through the full data record together. Movil still wanted to attribute the anomalies to equipment drift. I understand the appeal of that explanation. Equipment drift is a comfortable conclusion because it leaves the model intact. It means the numbers were wrong rather than the model. I have told the committee already why I no longer believe it was equipment drift, and the calibration records I am attaching to this report will demonstrate that the instruments were operating within specification throughout. What I want to describe instead is the conversation Delvin Sorath and I had after Moval went to her quarters. He said, I looked up the contact history in the full survey database, not just the tolerance summary in the data file, the actual contact records. I asked him what he had found. He said the contact history showed 31 documented survey encounters with human subjects. Of those 31, the majority had been short-duration contacts, brief assessments conducted under field conditions, with subjects who were already in some state of prior physiological stress from the circumstances of contact. Initial encounters, captive transport conditions, the stress of first contact with an unknown species. Only 4 had involved structured assessment protocols of more than 24 hours duration. Of those 4, 3 had been conducted under the supervision of teams with no environmental biology specialization. Their monitoring was adequate for the parameters they were measuring, but not designed to capture the subtler cascade indicators that a trained assessor looks for. The fourth had been conducted by a qualified assessor, but the subject had been significantly ill at the time of assessment, and the results had been filed with a note recommending they not be incorporated into baseline calibration data. We had built our human data file almost entirely on contact data that was unsuited to establishing upper bound tolerance parameters. Every number in that data file was essentially a floor measurement being used as if it were a ceiling measurement. Delvin Sarath said, "We have been using a floor as if it were a ceiling." I told him that was an accurate summary. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We have a base of operations inside a human-built structure. We are operating in a region that has human population. We are on a planet with a large and apparently well-distributed human population. And the best data we have on what humans can tolerate was built from a sample that tells us almost nothing about the upper end of their range." I said that was also accurate. He said, "What do we do with that?" I told him we file the report and let the survey command make the operational decisions. That is the honest answer. That is also the answer that allowed me to stop thinking about it for the rest of the night, which I recognized at the time as a reason to be suspicious of it. But I want to be honest with the committee about what I was thinking while I said it. I was thinking about the stores in the lower section of the structure, sufficient for 3 years without resupply. I was thinking about a man who had been in a progressively oxygen-depleted room for 3 days and had described it as a little thin. I was thinking about 6% cortisol elevation at the 96-hour mark of what I had designed as a meaningful environmental stress protocol. I was thinking about the word comfortable, which was the word he had used on day 3 when I asked him through the intercom how he was holding up. I was thinking about his pacing on day 5, deliberate, measured. A person tending their own physical condition with the routine competence of someone who knew exactly what their body required and was providing it. There is a broader question embedded in this data that I want to raise explicitly because I think it has relevance beyond the scope of my assessment mandate. We arrived at this structure because it was convenient, reinforced construction, independent systems, well-provisioned. Subcommander Okal assessed it as an ideal staging facility and occupied it without any particular concern about why it was the way it was. What kind of being builds a structure like this? What does the design of this structure tell you about how the species that built it models its own environment? About what they have decided is a reasonable contingency to prepare for. We noted the 3-year provision store and filed it as an indicator of unusual forethought. We did not pause to ask what prior experience with their own world had taught a member of this species that 3 years of isolated self-sufficiency, a contingency worth systematic preparation. I am not a military analyst. I will not speculate beyond my professional lane. The 2 things I have just described are connected. The structure and the man who built it reflect the same underlying calculation, and the data I collected in 5 days suggests that the calculation is not irrational. I want to close with the final interaction I had with the subject, because I think it belongs in the record. On the morning of the 6th day, after I had ended the protocol, I went to the assessment chamber personally to conduct the post-protocol interview. Standard procedure. You ask the subject how they experienced the assessment, what they noticed, what was difficult. The data tells you what the body did. The interview tells you what the subject's conscious relationship to the experience was. He was sitting where I always found him, at the work table, now occupied with a small mechanical task. He had disassembled a clip mechanism from the bunk frame and was cleaning and reassembling it with evident methodical pleasure, the way a person works on something familiar whose maintenance they find quietly satisfying. He had laid out the small parts in an organized arrangement on the table surface and was working through them in sequence. I asked him, through the translator, how he had experienced the past 5 days. He set down the part he was working on and thought about it genuinely, the way a person thinks about a question they are taking seriously. He said it had been manageable. He said the first 2 nights were a bit uncomfortable because of the temperature, but he had found a way to stay warm enough. He described layering the available clothing and positioning himself away from the cold wall, and after that it hadn't really bothered him. He said the thin air had given him a headache twice, but headaches passed. He said the food was a little light, but not enough to make him weak, just hungry, and hungry he had handled before. He said the irregular lighting had taken him a day to figure out, but once he got a feel for the pattern in it, he slept reasonably well. I asked him what he meant by, got a feel for the pattern. The illumination cycling had been designed to be irregular, pseudo-random, resistant to deliberate pattern recognition. He considered this for a moment. He said it was hard to explain. It was less something he analyzed, and more something he felt his way through. He described it as similar to learning how weather moves in a particular location. Not of rules you memorize, but a sense you develop from being in a place long enough. A feel for the rhythm of things, even when the rhythm is irregular. He said his body had just sorted it out eventually. He seemed a little uncertain about how to articulate it, as though he was describing a process that was mostly not conscious. I noted, without saying so, that this was precisely what my monitoring data had shown. A process that occurred below voluntary awareness, a biological mechanism routing around an obstacle it had not been consciously assigned to address. He went back to his reassembly work after a moment, fitting a small component into its housing, with practiced precision. I asked him, before I left, if there was anything he wanted. He said he would still appreciate that coffee, if we ever managed to source it. Then he said, the repair compound for the heating element was the gray container, not the blue one. Both were in the green cabinet under the main stairs, and the blue was a sealant. They looked similar, easy to mix up, but the gray was what I wanted for the ceramic housing repair. He had not been in the main level of the structure. He had not been permitted access to the supply room, the main stairs, or any part of the facility outside the assessment chamber, since the day he was brought up from the lower section. He had been in this structure before we occupied it, and he knew where the supplies were with the specificity of a person describing a room they have visited often. I thanked him and left. I have spent considerable time since our survey team departed the structure, thinking about how to write this report in a way that conveys what I actually observed without either overstating it or understating it. The temptation to understate is real, because the data is unusual enough that I am aware it invites skepticism, and because the equipment drift interpretation is superficially defensible and would require less revision of our current models. But I was there. I watched the readouts in real time, across 5 days, in a monitoring suite whose calibration I verified repeatedly. I watched the subjects sustain 96 hours of multi-parameter environmental load and produce a final stress hormone reading of 6% above baseline. I watched him file a maintenance request about an ergonomic inconvenience on day 4. I watched him ask for a carpentry project on day 5 because he was bored. I watched him on the last morning reassemble a clip mechanism with the quiet satisfaction of a person who had nothing in particular to complain about. The committee will draw its own conclusions about the operational implications. My role is to report what I measured accurately and to flag when my data requires a revision to existing models. Our existing model for human environmental tolerance, the parameters, the cascade thresholds, the documented upper bounds, requires revision. The sample on which it was built is inadequate, and the data I collected in 5 days of structured assessment sits above the range that sample established. By how much I cannot say with precision. I never found the ceiling. What I found was the region above the floor, and I found that it was significantly larger than our data file suggested. How much larger I cannot tell the committee. That would require a longer study, a larger sample, and access to subjects under better controlled prior conditions than I had. What I can tell the committee is this. The subject I assessed spent 5 days in conditions our data file said should produce measurable physiological distress. He described those conditions afterward as manageable. He used that word specifically, manageable. Filing this report with a recommendation that our human tolerance data file be reclassified as preliminary, pending reassessment, and that future survey teams operating in human-populated zones request a certified environmental biology specialist review before establishing long-term facilities and structures of human construction. I am also filing a separate note with Sub-Commander Okel's logistics team recommending that the Gray repair compound from the green cabinet under the main stairs be used for the heating element in the middle level assessment chamber. He was right about the blue one, I checked.